Okay, so this is chapter 14. What I want to do with chapter 14 is give you a little bit of an intro. I'm going to do the first 8 slides because due to connection issues, those did not come through. And then the other 2 recordings will pick up for the rest of the chapter. It's a bit of a long chapter, so it's kind of broken up a bit. So when we take a look at the nervous system, that's going to be the focus of chapter 14. So we're going to take a look at the nervous system, and what I want to do is basically sketch out the main portions of the nervous system. So when you take a look at the nervous system, the job of the nervous system is to both receive and process information coming from the outside world, that's sensory information, both from the outside world, basically the external information, and also your internal, basically inside your body. So it's collecting information and intelligence from both areas. And it divides itself up into 2 main branches. So first of all, you have your central nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord. So a lot of this is associated with integration and of these incoming sources of information. And then, of course, you have your peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves in your periphery and everything that's outside of your central nervous system. So mostly what you have contact with is your peripheral nervous system. So if you take a look at your central nervous system, it's composed of the brain itself and also of the spinal cord. Now, the nerves, which basically are heading out in the periphery of the body, are part of the peripheral nervous system. But there's a special class of nerves called the cranial nerves. We'll talk about those later in the chapter, that for the most part are connected to your senses. And the reason why they call them cranial is because they're actually coming off of the central nervous system. And so that's why they're called cranial nerves. The rest of the nerves are coming off the spinal cord. That's why they're called spinal nerves. So when you take a look at the organization of this, you'll see that basically you'll have your brain, which is your primary integrator, and your spinal cord, and the 2 of these talk to each other. So you have the brain sending signals to the spinal cord and through the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sending signals to the brain. The process. Now, generally, if you want to take a look at the pathway of sensation, what you usually have is a situation where, hold on 1 second, the PowerPoint is acting up on me. To get away from technical issues. So, from the sensory side of things, you're going to have sensation. So this is basically the starting point here. And so often what will happen is you will receive visceral information. This is signals that are coming from your organs, from inside. You're collecting information from inside your body. And then you have what's called somatic sensory. This is the stuff that's coming and collecting information from the outside of the world, like, for instance, those receptors in your skin and your muscles, your joints, your senses. This is basically coming from inside, the visceral side versus outside information coming in. So you're collecting information on both sides. Now that information is going to coalesce into what's called the afferent or the sensory nerves. And these nerves in the spinal cord will basically take the information that you've collected up to the brain, and then the brain will integrate that, make some sort of a decision about that, and then it'll basically send the response to the spinal cord, which will then move out of the spinal cord through what's called the efferent nerves or the motor nerves. And so these will go to the effectors or the targets. So you're telling some sort of a tissue in your body to do something in response to the information that you've just collected sensory-wise. And so you break it up into a couple of pieces. First of all, you have your somatic motor nerves, which are essentially targeting skeletal muscles. These are all voluntary types of movements. If you want to move your hand, for instance. You also will send these information to autonomic motors. So these are basically on autopilot. So these are the things that you don't think about. These are the involuntary things. For instance, going to smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands, right? So things that your body has to do internally that you don't have to think about all the time. And then as a result, the autonomic motor system will be further subdivided into two very important subdivisions. The first one is called your sympathetic division. It's also nicknamed your fight or flight. This is your stress response. And the other one is your parasympathetic division, which is called your rest and digest. This is your at rest. So this is like your stress response. And the parasympathetic is your at rest state. And so depending on where you are or what you need to do, you can basically send messages to both halves of that autonomic system. Now, the nervous system has basically three main functions. So the first one is obviously sensation. So basically your sensory receptors, you have receptors that are going to be out there collecting information. They're going to be responding to the stimuli by generating these nerve signals that will basically go through the nerves in the peripheral nervous system, and they'll go to the central nervous system, typically by way of the spinal cord. Then once they go to and reach the brain, then it's time for integration. So the CNS will basically take all the different inputs, good, bad, or indifferent. Some are positive, some are negative, some are exciting, some are inhibitory. It'll sum up all those inputs that it receives from across the body, and then it'll basically create the appropriate response. So their brain is basically sorting through all this information and choosing what the appropriate response is to send out. It also has the capacity to store a memory of that input and, of course, of that decision. And then the last major piece is your motor function. And your motor function basically is your motor output. So now once you have the response coming from the brain, then it's going to travel to the peripheral nervous system, and then it's going to target and go to the either muscles, glands, or organs in order to tell them what to do. And then the instructions will basically be telling those particular target tissues that they need to do whatever it is that they need to do based on whatever decision the brain made. Now, when you take a look at nervous tissue, you have a couple of major types of cells in nervous tissue. So you have neurons, whose job it is to basically transmit nerve impulses. So these are the conductive cells. These are the ones sending the nervous signal to your target tissues. The other one is neuroglia. So neuroglia are basically there for support and for nourishment of the neurons. And so there's a lot more of these guys than there are of neurons. And you have a lot of different types. For instance, you have microglia, which is a type of neuroglia, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes. And in the peripheral nervous system, you have Schwann cells, which are sort of like oligodendrocytes, only they're in the peripheral and not in the central. So let's take a closer look at some of these neuroglia. Microglia is typically a phagocytic cell, so they're kind of like immune cells, and their job is to remove bacteria. And they kind of provide like a little bit of a protection for the neural tissue. The second major piece is the astrocytes. Now, the astrocytes' job is both for structural support of the neurons themselves, but also metabolic support. Matter of fact, the astrocytes will form what's called the blood-brain barrier. So oftentimes the astrocytes will be responsible for picking and choosing the nutrients to transport into the neuron. Then you have oligodendrocytes. And oligodendrocytes basically are a type of cell that forms what's called a myelin sheath, which is kind of like an insulation or a layer of insulation that wraps around the axons of the neurons. Of course, the axons, if you recall, is the conductive process, the long one that extends off of the neuron itself. We'll talk more about that in the future slides. And then, of course, you have the Schwann cells, which are like oligodendrocytes. They also form a myelin sheath, but in this case, they're in the peripheral nervous system. So, for instance, most of the nerves that you see in your arm or your leg are going to be peripheral nerves, and they will be covered with Schwann cells. This is like wire insulation. So your axon is transmitting an electrical signal. That's your action potential, your nerve impulse. And in order to create very sort of intentional forward directional movement of that electrical signal, you cover with insulation, the same way you cover a copper wire with insulation to make sure that you get purposeful unidirectional flow of electricity through the wire itself. So that kind of covers our neuroglia. And that is also going to cover the end of this little intro. The next video will pick up at slide 9 and then work with the neurons going forward.